Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to review episode 6 of Star Trek Picard, or as some people like to call it, STP. And this episode actually wasn't as bad as the previous one. It did have some neat moments, it did have some nice references to previous shows in a correct way. It even had a very funny moment, which I think was unintentionally funny, but I still give it as a point for the show because at least it entertained me. And they finally finished one of the subplots which I think were the most boring parts of the show, that whole subplot on the Borg cube, which was dragging on, and it felt like a very bad soap opera. So they finally kind of wrapped up, not completely, but they finally got somewhere with that whole subplot, and so I was happy about that. And that's one of my problems with this show, that the story seems to be dragging on, and they're not in a hurry to finish it, and they fill it with soap opera filler and all kinds of pointless stuff, and it's not good pacing, and that's why I miss the old style of the Star Trek shows, in which every episode had its own story usually, and that way it forced the show to have good pacing. They couldn't drag it on endlessly, and yet in these new shows they can always have a to be continued, and to force us to wait another week and then another week and another week, and it never finishes, and that's really annoying in my opinion, especially when it's not good. Like a lot of shows do that today, but usually they have a lot of meat to it. It has every episode still has a lot of stuff going on, and yet in this show it just felt so boring so many times, and it's just so pointless. They could have easily cut out like half of the stuff, or to minimize it, to do it much faster, and so that's what was annoying me probably most of all in this series. It was simply boring, and so in this episode they finally got to the point of one of the subplots, the one on the Borg cube. Some of the visuals on the Borg cube was good. Even the acting got much better by some of those actors, which I always complained about. At least in a few moments they did have some good acting finally. They had a good reference to something in Voyager, and this is something that this show is doing much better than Star Trek Discovery. One of the things I complained most about in that show is that it felt like whoever wrote it never watched any Star Trek at all, and even when they tried to get a reference, they got it wrong oftentimes, and there were so many missed opportunities, so many times in which they could have tied something together and they didn't, and that's probably was the most annoying thing, because they could have easily fixed it with just a little tweak and they didn't, so that really pissed me off. So Discovery had such bad continuity with all the other Star Trek shows, and yet in Picard they do often do references and get them right, so that shows me that someone did pay attention to some of the details from Star Trek. However, I think in the visual department, Discovery was actually much better, even though I complained a lot about the style of that show, everything being so dark and blue, and all the lens flares and blurriness and all that stuff, and I still complain about all of that, and this show has a similar problem, even though not as much I think. But at least in Discovery it still felt expensive, and some scenes were pretty good visually. A lot of the action scenes and the props, the spacesuits, stuff like that was obviously very expensive on Discovery. However, this show seems to be so cheap and lazy in that department. It's really disappointing. In this episode, for example, they showed some flashback scenes, and it was all from First Contact and some of the episodes. And they had like screen grabs from all kinds of episodes showing something else, but I could recognize every single one of them, and it was very lazy. I'll get to that in a moment when I analyze it. And even when they showed the inside of the Borg cube in some shots, which were good in the design, like I like to see that kind of stuff. However, it kind of looked like a cheap CGI, it didn't really look that realistic. So I kind of like the attempt, but I think it could and should have been done better. Even First Contact, when they showed that scene of the inside of the Borg cube, it looked much better than what we saw in this episode, which looked kind of a video game almost. So the visual quality of this show I think is not as good as Discovery. And also, as always, it had a bunch of stupid moments and all kinds of unnecessary scenes, all kinds of filler scenes, stuff that takes way too long, like getting the permission to get to the Borg cube, so they have to contact Starfleet, and for some reason Picard cannot do that. Like no one would do Picard a favor. Picard was in Starfleet most of his life, and he saved the whole Federation, and yet apparently he has no friends in Starfleet at all. Instead they have to get Raffi, who I always call Sarah Connor, because I think they kind of try to rip off that character in the way that they make her behave and look and all of that. The Sarah Connor from Terminator 2, who was kind of crazy and all of that, it kind of reminds me of this character. And she always drinks and smokes, and she believes in conspiracies, and no one believes her, not even her own son. Just like John Connor in Terminator 2 said, no one believed her, not even me. And so maybe that's why they had that scene of her meeting her son, who doesn't believe her and all that stuff. And of course, maybe in the end of the season she will prove to be right, and then she will be the hero and all of that. And so anyway, so she's the one to contact Starfleet to ask for a favor, and she talks to some female captain, We can see the rank that she's only a captain. And so I'm like thinking, doesn't Picard have a lot more friends in Starfleet over the years? Shouldn't he have a bunch of people who served under him who are now captains or even admirals? So shouldn't he be the one to contact Starfleet? Instead, they give it to Raffi, who is intoxicated and on drugs, and somehow that works. And she even insults Picard while she's doing that. That's also one of the problems in this show, that in almost every single episode, people constantly insult Picard for stuff that he's not responsible for, or stuff that isn't true, like saying he has hubris, effing hubris, and here they say that he has a giant ego. And if you watch the actual show of TNG, it's the complete opposite. How many episodes he did some good things without taking credit for it, doing something for the greater good, not for any kind of personal gains. I have a lot of examples like that, so it makes no sense to hear people talking about him in that way. Now maybe that happened later after the show, maybe he did become like that, or people thought he's like that, but still it's so often, it's so insulting to hear people bashing him almost every episode, and he doesn't even defend himself, so that kind of shows that he agrees with that criticism, that he constantly has to apologize for something, as if he is guilty of that. So that's annoying across the whole show. And so they have that scene of Raffi contacting Starfleet, talking to that woman, and it takes so long to get somewhere with that, I think some 2 or 3 minutes. And I'm thinking it's totally unnecessary. They could have said it happened off screen, that they got permission, or maybe they faked permission off screen to get to that place without trouble, and that's it. They didn't have to do this long scene, which doesn't really give anything to the story of the show. So I guess the only purpose it serves is to give that character something to do, to show that she's still useful, even more useful than Picard apparently, even though it makes no sense. So just to give her something to do, that's why they had that scene, even though that scene is not necessary for the plot of the episode. And that's again one of the problems in the show, that they keep dragging stuff, and it creates bad pacing, it makes it boring to have all kinds of unnecessary scenes like this. So when they get to the Borg cube, Picard suddenly has all those PTSD flashbacks, and what kind of annoyed me is that he keeps seeing things from First Contact, from actual scenes that we saw in the movie, of places that he didn't see himself. And that was long after he was assimilated, so you cannot even argue that those were memories of the time he was a Borg, because all of that stuff took place later. So for example, he sees that scene in which people from the Enterprise E were getting assimilated by the Borg, but Picard didn't see that, so why is he now remembering all that kind of stuff? So that's simply lazy. They simply wanted to recycle old footage instead of filming new ones. So I felt that's kind of lazy and cheap, because they have all this Borg makeup, they have all these new Borgs going around in this new cube, so couldn't they simply film a few minutes of all kinds of stuff with that, instead of recycling the old footage from First Contact of actual scenes in which Picard wasn't in, and so it makes no sense? I mean, at least show the stuff from TNG, because that's stuff that Picard would actually remember, and so that at least would make sense. But I guess they just wanted the prettier stuff from First Contact, which looked better, so that's why they took that. And also, even that scene of him having that drill in the eye, which he also dreamed about in First Contact, but that annoyed me even in First Contact, because it never actually happened. He never actually got his eye replaced. So that stuff with the drill doesn't make sense, and he sees that again here. And this show seems to have like a fetish for ripping people's eyes out and all of that, like they did in the previous episode. And even before that in Discovery, they had that scene of the guy getting stabbed in the eye. So it feels like the showrunners have some sort of fetish about harming people's eyes and all of that, so I'm getting tired of that. So he has all these flashbacks, but fine, they were so fast you're not really supposed to notice this from the movies. Only someone like me who knows all that stuff by heart would notice, so fine, I can forgive that. The old Star Trek shows also did that kind of stuff. But what annoyed me more than that is that scene of him looking at the computer of all kinds of images of stuff about the Borg and the Romulans, and all of that was also screen grabs from Deep Space Nine and from TNG, from episodes that I recognize, and so that felt really lazy, that they couldn't even try to modify it a little bit so it wouldn't be so recognizable. Like they have that scene of the Romulan Senate from that episode of Deep Space Nine in season 7 when Bashir was on Romulus, and so that was the exact same footage. And here it's presented as if it's the treaty that they signed with the Romulans about the Borg cube. And then he sees an image of himself as Locutus, and you can see that it has the view screen of the Enterprise D in the image itself, and so that makes no sense. I mean, I'm fine with the idea of the Enterprise saving all the footage they had of Locutus, so it's totally fine, but yet why does it look as if that was filmed from the bridge of the Enterprise D together with the screen itself? Like, it makes no sense. Couldn't they take a screen grab from the view screen itself without seeing the view screen itself as if from on the bridge, and so that kind of pissed me off because it's stupid. It's like someone just pulled it from Google Images, someone just looked up Locutus and just grabbed the first few images they found, and they wanted to use the image of Locutus looking right at the camera because they wanted to do the whole thing with the superposition, and so they needed to find an image of him looking straight to the camera, so they just took that image from the episode in which he was on the view screen, but they took it together with the view screen itself, and that makes it stupid and unnecessary. They could have simply cut off the part with the screen. It's all on a transparent hologram anyway, it wouldn't matter. And the biggest mistake in the scene is that just because they wanted to show to us from the other side of the holographic view screen as if those implants are on today's Picard, to do that they had to mirror the image, and so when he looks at it from the other side, the implants are on the other side of his face, which is not the way it was in the actual episode, and so they only did that because they wanted to show it to us from the other side as if the implants are on this Picard, and so they had to mirror the image, and it makes no sense. Why would the image on the computer be reversed, be mirrored? But anyway, the scene itself I think isn't bad, like showing us that he still has kind of a PTSD from all of that, even though it can be argued that he is over all of that even in the show itself, and then in the movie he seemed to overcome his desire for revenge and all of that stuff. They dealt with that already, and so doing that again decades later seems to be a little bit, the way they did it seemed to be a little bit exaggerated. I would be fine with doing that a little bit, but it seems like it's the first time ever that he confronted with any of this. So it was a little bit over the top, and there was that scene of him kind of shouting and saying the Borg don't change, and that doesn't make sense because he witnessed himself how some Borg changed, for example, in the episode Descent, which the writers of this show probably skipped because they have a lot of stuff that could have tied into the show in those episodes, and they totally forgot about that. For example, what happened with Lore was never explained. So it's as if they skipped the episode Descent, and that explains why Picard doesn't believe that the Borg can change, even though he did witness himself of groups of Borg who got disconnected from the collective and became individuals again, and not just Hugh and not just himself, but even all those big group of Borg drones in Descent. And so why does he now say the Borg cannot change? He knows that this cube is disconnected, and yet he still kind of hates them and fears them and all of that, so it made no sense. But because he has PTSD, maybe he has a little bit of Aromodic syndrome, which contributes to all of that. So that's my usual excuse every time something doesn't make sense or something is stupid about what Picard says or does. I always say that's the Aromodic syndrome causing that, so at least we have that kind of excuse. So suddenly he has massive PTSD attacks and flashbacks, and his hand is shaking, and despite all of that he overcomes that and goes to the Borg cube. So I guess that's nice. At least at least the main hero is not perfect. He has flaws and weaknesses, and he overcomes that, and so I do like that element. And at least he was right in saying that he never set foot on a Borg cube since the first time he was assimilated. That is technically correct, so it's not a mistake, even though he did face the Borg many other times since then. And the stuff on the Borg cube itself, I do kind of like it, because first of all, visually they did show the size of the Borg cube, and the whole thing with the walls moving and all of that. I think even though we didn't see it previously, but it does make sense, because the Borg cube is a structure that is able to repair itself and all of that. We saw that in the very first appearance of the Borg, that the cube can repair itself, and so it makes sense for it to be made from all these moving parts and all of that. And it did look kind of cool, and so I don't really have a problem with that, even though it doesn't fit visually other cubes we saw. Also, it's possible that this is a new cube, which is not the same as previous ones, and so that's why I don't have a problem with the cube looking different. Maybe it's a more advanced cube. And then we had that scene of Picard almost falling down, and then he's scared when the Borg grab him, but then it turns out they're actually saving him from falling. And then he meets the ex-Borg drone called Hugh, who he saved during TNG, and so I love the fact that we have this character back, and I think this is one of the few times in which one of these old characters who has a cameo actually feels natural to the story, and it's done in a satisfying way without destroying the character, without trying to change him, and it feels like a natural progression of the character. And so I did kind of like all the parts with Hugh, even though him and Picard kind of hugging as if they're old friends doesn't really make sense. It would make sense if they said previously that he actually met him a few times before the show, which we didn't see. Then I'd be totally fine with that, and yet it seemed previously when he was looking him up as if he doesn't know anything about what he's doing, that he's even there, and he's surprised to see how he looks like and all of that. So it's as if they never met since TNG, and yet in TNG when they met again in Descent, Hugh said that he is not happy to see the Enterprise people, and he had no warm feelings for anyone except Geordi, who he saw as his friend, and yet he was actually being very hostile toward the other Enterprise crew members. So why is he now kind of jumping at Picard and hugging him and all of that? It felt a little bit over the top, and maybe if they established that they actually were in some kind of friendship before all of this, then it would make sense. If they said something, oh, I haven't seen you for 10 years or something like that, then that would establish that they actually met before all of this, and so maybe that's when they became friends, when Hugh became more human and realized that Picard is the one who freed him and all of that, then it would make sense. And yet here they haven't apparently seen each other since TNG, and they're now hugging each other, even though Hugh wasn't that polite toward Picard when they met in Descent. So I think that in this episode, all the scenes on the Borg cube were actually much better than the rest of the episode. Usually it's the opposite. Usually the scenes on the Borg cube was the most boring part. In this episode, it's the best part, and all the parts on the ship was the worst part. So for example, that scene of Tilly 2 hooking up with the Wolverine captain is totally, once again, like a soap opera, totally unnecessary, totally a filler. And it even had some dumb dialogue which reminds me of the Star Wars prequels, like when she started saying that space is cold and empty and it gets everywhere, something like that. It reminds me of that line by Anakin about sand, and so it was totally like that, and in a romantic scene no less. And then after that they sleep together right away. And also I hate how that ship doesn't have any sets. Like I think we have only one big set of the bridge and maybe sickbay, and that's it. We don't actually see any rooms, any corridors of that ship, and so again it feels very lazy visually. Like they didn't invest in any actual props or sets or any of that on the ship. And that's why that scene was also taking place on the bridge, and he was playing soccer on the bridge apparently, that backside of the bridge. So he's playing soccer and drinking alcohol at the same time, which also seems kind of stupid. So he's always smoking and drinking in every scene. Even when he plays soccer, he has to take a sip of some alcohol even as he's sweating from sports, so that's kind of stupid. And then they hook up, which at least it kind of fits what we saw in previous episodes of them kind of checking each other out and starting conversations, and so at least it did feel kind of natural. And as for Space Legolas, I think he's the most useless character on the show yet. His only purpose seems to be to cut off people's heads with a sword, even though they all have phasers and all of that, so I think a sword should be pretty much useless, because the only way he can kill people is sneaking behind them to catch them by surprise with a sword. Otherwise he would be totally useless. And he always says dumb stuff, and I guess it's supposed to be funny, and I usually like characters like that, like the muscle of the team, like someone who only says a few words, a man of a few words, and yet whenever there's some action, he's the most badass, and so I love characters like that usually, and yet in this case, I think so far, he's not that entertaining. He always says stupid stuff to show as if he's totally ignorant of anything. He doesn't know anything about anything. As for the Romulannisters, Spork and his evil sister, at least finally Spork becomes competent. Suddenly he's not a weakling compared to his sister. Suddenly he fights back. Suddenly he proves he's more clever than her. He finally fights back against her because she was constantly dominating him and insulting him, humiliating him. And yet in this episode he suddenly stands up to her. So I guess it was a nice change, because I kept expecting, oh, now she will slap him around again and all of that, which was really annoying. But suddenly he proves himself more competent than her, and he's psychoanalyzing Sushi and breaking into her subconscious through her dreams and all of that. And in this episode she finally learns what she is, and so finally we're getting somewhere with that whole plot line. And they also found out what planet she's from, because she described her dreams, and in those dreams she saw two moons in the sky with some lightning storm in space, as they always do in these shows. For some reason they think there are clouds out in space. They do that in Discovery all the time. Always in space there are clouds with lightning storms, and so just based on that image that she described from her dream of two moons in a lightning storm, they are now able to find the planet that she came from. Out of billions of planets, it makes little sense to me, and all based on her description of a dream without even seeing anything specific that she was talking about. So how can you possibly find anything based on that description? If they had something a little bit more unique that she saw, then maybe I could buy that. You know, Data also had the dream programs, and his subconscious mind was showing him stuff. So it's similar to that, so I have no problem with the general idea in this episode, but the details is where it kind of sucks. Also that whole Romulan ritual in that room and all of that was kind of silly. And then after he got that information from her, he tries to kill her. And even though he knows that she's a powerful android, he decides to kill her with some device which releases a cloud of radiation. That's what they said, a cloud of radiation. I guess it's like the Theleron radiation in Nemesis. It was kind of similar to that, so I guess that's what it was. And it kind of spreads very slowly, and so she knows she's in danger, and that's why she escapes. So doesn't it seem very stupid? If he knows that she's such a powerful android, then why doesn't he establish a force field around the room that she cannot escape from? I mean, he seems to be in charge. He has all this authority over all the other Romulans. So why didn't he tell them establish a force field around the room? And why didn't he simply put some kind of powerful bomb inside there or something? Some antimatter would cause a big explosion, which would get her by surprise. Instead, he chooses to kill her with a device which slowly releases a cloud of toxins that she sees and is able to escape. So that makes him look dumb. And I don't like dumb characters, and I don't like dumb villains. I mean, if he thought she's human, that would make sense, but he knows what she is, and so why is he being so stupid? Why didn't I take some precautions at least? The only thing I liked in that scene is that finally we see some good acting in him, because we see that he cries when he does that, because maybe he does love her, and yet he still carries out his duty, so we see that conflict in him, and I guess it will lead to something later, maybe in the end of the season, he will switch to her side, he will save her in the end, and all of that. All this plot kind of reminds me of the whole Ash Tyler thing in Discovery, of him being a spy and then trying to kill Michael Burnham, and then later they are still lovers for some reason, because they had that whole forced romance, and so it's really similar in this show with this character. So he's like the bad boy who will turn good in the end because of love. So love will save it all in the end and all of that, so that's really predictable and like a soap opera and all of that, so I guess we'll wait and see how they will do it. But at least the actor had some good acting moments in this scene. Also, before all of this, I kind of liked how she started to discover what she is, and she starts to scan all the objects in her room and discovering that they're only a few months old. And we know from previous Star Trek shows that they are able to do quantum dating of objects, and they can know how old the specific object is. I guess if it was replicated a few years ago, you would be able to tell that it's replicated. That can also explain why some ancient artifacts can have value, because if you are able to scan it and know that it's thousands of years old, then you'd know that it's authentic. That can explain why Picard had all those valuable archaeological stuff, and how he said he had to trade the stuff for it. So that always was a little bit fishy because of the replicator, but if they have such a device like the quantum dating, then it explains why people would know that if something is real or not, and so it would have value. So anyway, she scans everything she owns and discovers it was all made around 3 years previously. It's too bad she didn't scan herself as well, because then she would see that her own body was also made a few years ago, so that was a missed opportunity. It was also funny how they showed that every time she talks to her mother, who I guess isn't real, she's just a hologram, every time she talks with her, she falls asleep. We saw that in previous episodes as well, and I always found that funny, because that's kind of how I feel when I watch 70 seconds of this show. I also feel like I want to fall asleep in the middle of it. So it turns out that she needs to sleep in order to not discover the truth about herself, and then Spork takes her to that meditation room, and he psychoanalyzes her dreams until she discovers what she is, and she cannot see her father in those dreams because his face is all messed up. That kind of reminds me of that movie with Jim Carrey, in which he wanted to erase his own memory, and then he was reliving those memories, and he saw someone in those visions which he cannot see his face, and so that reminds me of that. Also, some scenes in this show reminds me of Total Recall, that whole idea of memory implants, that maybe your whole life that you remember is actually fake. It was implanted in you for some specific purpose, and you are not aware of it. So we had similar stuff in Total Recall. I guess it might have inspired parts of the show, like that whole thing about Mars, the global meltdown of Mars, and that scene in which the first android girl was activated when they attacked her, just like that scene in Total Recall, when Arnold suddenly had the abilities to fight which he didn't know he has. We had that alien bar, and we had a little person, woman playing on the piano. That kind of reminded me of the little person on Mars in those funny scenes. So maybe it's all a coincidence, but I keep sensing that there are similarities to all kinds of other science fiction movies which might have inspired this one. Raffi reminds me of Sarah Connor, and in this episode we had Picard finally meeting the android girl and telling her, "Come with me if you want to leave," or something like that. He said something similar, so that also reminded me of that. So anyway, Hugh takes Picard on a tour around the cube, and he shows him all the former Borg drones that they liberate from their implants. And what I found fishy in those scenes is how come some of those Borg drones who are just now getting liberated from their implants, how come they already have long hair? Because Borg drones were always hairless, they always were clean shaven, and some of them still are, and yet some of them already have long hair, even though only now they get their implants removed from their head. But maybe those are wigs, maybe they accelerated their hair growth so that they'll look normal, faster, so that they'll be able to recover psychologically. I guess that can be an excuse, but it still looked kind of off. Why are some of them having long hair? And also something fishy that only now Picard realized that the Borg drones who got liberated, they're actually victims and there's no reason to fear them or hate them. How come only now he realizes that? I mean, he himself is a former Borg drone. He got assimilated in the past, and some people even mistreated him because of that, such as Admiral Satie, who blamed him for that, or even Captain Sisko was kind of hostile toward Picard because he used to be Borg for a short while and was forced to do all those things. And he met Seven of Nine previously, who's an ex-Borg, so how come only now he realizes that former Borg drones are actually victims? Even Hugh himself, he realized that about him even in the TNG episode I, Borg, and later in Descent, when he helped free all those Borg drones from lore, and then allowed them to live on that planet. So how come suddenly he has an irrational hate and fear from the Borg drones who he knows are separated from the collective, and he has to be explained of the fact that they are just victims? So that didn't really make much sense, unless he has Iromodic syndrome and he just forgot everything that he knows already from the previous shows. And so again, that's the only explanation to explain kind of the stupidity of Picard in this show. So anyway, then they try to save Soshi, and they manage to meet her just in the nick of time at exactly the right moment when she escapes from that room, and that's when they help her out. So this was all very convenient timing. So the script writing seems to be very lazy. So Picard just happens to arrive just at the right moment to help save her as the Romulans finally decide to kill her, and so that was very convenient. And then there was the unintentional comedy moment, which I literally laughed out loud, and that was when they were all running through the corridors. Picard and Hugh are running through the corridors, and there are all these ex-Borg drones walking around, and most of them who interacted with Picard previously, no one recognized him. No one said anything to him previously, and only now when he runs through the corridor, and there's like a tenseful music playing, and it's a tense moment, and they're running, it's like an action scene, and suddenly one of the random ex-Borg drones in the corridor sees him and he says, "Locutus?" And Picard kind of looks back and then keeps running. That moment kind of cracked me up because it was kind of random and it was so strange, especially because of the tone that guy said it, as if he saw like an old friend in the supermarket or something, like, "Oh, Locutus, is that you, buddy? How are you, dude?" Like, it was that kind of tone, like meeting a random friend somewhere, like, "Oh, Locutus, is that you?" So that really kind of made me laugh, and had to rewind that part a few times to figure out why this is so funny. And it felt like unintentional comedy. Like, I don't think they wanted it to be funny. I think it was simply supposed to be to show that all the Borg still remember him and all of that, which they mentioned previously. And yet the other drones that he met previously didn't have that kind of reaction. No one looked at him strange, no one really said anything. I guess there was one guy who looked at him strange, but that felt normal. And yet suddenly, as he's running during an action scene, suddenly one of them says "Locutus" with a surprised tone, and it was kind of like meeting an old buddy. And I just found that really funny for some reason. It was like so strange, so random, so unexpected, and the tone was so funny because it was so unfitting to the scene that I just found it hilarious. And it reminds me of some of the scenes in the movie The Room, which was also unintentional comedy, and it had a lot of moments like that, of someone saying something stupid out of the blue, like, "Oh, hi Mark, how's your sex life?" Or, "Oh, hi Johnny, I didn't know it was you." Or that lady suddenly saying in the middle of conversation, "Oh, by the way, I have breast cancer," in a totally relaxed tone, as if it's nothing. So those kinds of moments was what made that movie so funny in an unintentional comedy kind of way, and so I find this moment the same kind of unintentional comedy. So it's like that guy was saying, "Oh, hi Locutus, I didn't know it was you. How's your sex life?" Like, while Picard is running, and he like kind of looks behind and then keeps running. So that was kind of funny. So I give it actually as a point for this show, because even if it's unintentional comedy, it's still comedy, so it was still entertaining. So anyway, in the end, Hugh takes them to a room, and then he reveals that the Borg actually have a long-range transporter to be used to evacuate the Queen in case of an emergency. And once I saw that, I kind of liked it because it reminds me of that unanswered question from First Contact of how did the Borg Queen escape from the previous cube when it was destroyed, how come she is still alive? And she only answered, you think in such three-dimensional terms. And of course, later in Voyager, we find out that you cannot actually kill the queen, they can simply make another one, or maybe there are multiple queens, and so even if you kill her, she comes back later. So I guess that can be the explanation, but it always bugged me the idea that if the queen was actually on that cube in TNG, then how come she couldn't do anything when they kidnapped Locutus? Why didn't she disconnect him? Because she did have that ability on Voyager. She was able to disconnect other drones, and also Data hacking the Borg cube and making it self-destruct doesn't really make sense if the queen was on that cube. So actually I always assumed that maybe the Borg queen left that cube after she put Locutus in charge. She kind of made him like a Borg king in a way to command the attack, so it's possible she was actually not on the cube later. Maybe she left on a smaller ship in that sphere, or maybe she beamed herself out. So when I saw this scene in the show, I kind of liked it because it was like a callback to that unanswered question. Now Hugh actually says that this is a technology called the spatial trajector, which the Borg assimilated from a species called the Sicarians, which was actually a nice reference to an episode of Voyager in which they met a planet with a long-range transporter, and they had a dilemma of whether or not they want to steal it, because those people didn't want to share their technology. They had their own prime directive, which was a nice kind of giving them a taste of their own medicine. And so some of the people on Voyager actually wanted to steal that technology, and in the end they didn't, and they left that planet even though they were offered to stay there. And I always kind of thought maybe they should have stayed there because it was a nice planet with nice people, and they could have simply stayed there and saved themselves all the trouble they got into later. That was, I think, in season 1. And so that's another reason why I kind of like this reference, because they said that the Borg assimilated those people, so if the Voyager crew would have stayed there, then they also would have got assimilated. So I guess it's a good idea they didn't stay. So that's one of the reasons I like this reference. And also the technology itself, they did say in that episode that the range is 40,000 light years, and that's exactly what they say here. The only problem I have with all of this is if the Borg actually have this kind of technology, then shouldn't that make them invincible? Because if they are able to beam to such distances, cannot they assimilate planets easily, just showing up on their planet with an army of drones without even having to send a ship, and so bypassing all the defenses of a planet, simply appearing on the surface immediately? So shouldn't it make it much easier for the Borg? And yet apparently they're only using that to save a queen from the cube in case of an emergency, so that's the only use they can find for it. Remember that episode in Deep Space Nine when they had to destroy the Iconian gateway because otherwise the Jem'Hadar would get it, and then they will become invincible, they'll be able to show up on any planet with a big army by surprise. That's very dangerous, and so they had to destroy the gate to prevent it from happening. And so now we find out that the Borg have a similar kind of gate, even though it's limited to only 40,000 light years, but that's still a very long distance, and I'm assuming it can bypass shields and all of that, and they can use it to send a whole army of drones to any planet they want. So shouldn't Picard's immediate concern would be to destroy this technology, or maybe to steal it, to take it to the Federation so they can find a defense? Shouldn't that be the most important thing once they discover it? Because this is an immediate threat to all humanoids in the galaxy, because the Borg can be so unstoppable with this kind of technology. And yet he doesn't even care about that. He totally doesn't think about this. So that makes little sense. Maybe we don't really know the state of the Borg collective in this time. Maybe after Janeway screwed them up in the last episode of Voyager, maybe they didn't fully recover since then, so maybe they're not really a big threat anymore as they were in the past. I guess that's the only explanation, and that's also a little problem in this show because they kind of made the Borg pathetic. They can never again be scary as a villain, because now they're showing them all as victims, they're showing them as kind of being pathetic, being controlled by Romulans and all of that, so they're not even scary anymore. I always assumed maybe the real Borg will show up later in the show to take back their cube and all of that. Maybe they will show the scary Borg, but I'm guessing they won't do that, because they seem to be going with this whole idea of the Borg who are hated in the galaxy, they're actually the victims. So I'm guessing maybe the collective is simply so weak now that they're not a threat to anyone, and that can explain why Picard is not worried that the Borg have this kind of technology. But I still found that fishy. At least if they said something, maybe this is the same Borg cube that assimilated that planet, so maybe this is the only cube with that kind of technology and the other ones don't have it. Or if Hugh told him that he will destroy it after he leaves, then it would make sense. And yet no one even cares about that. He simply says he will hide this room again after they leave, and so the Romulans will get their hands on that kind of technology. So wouldn't that make the remaining Romulans a big threat if they get their hands on that kind of technology? So it bugs me that no one even cares about that problem. No one is concerned about that. Picard doesn't care anymore, so I guess the Iromodic syndrome again, that's the only excuse. But at least that scene showed me that they do pay attention to some of the details, that they're tying all kinds of loose ends together, that they pay attention and they get the references right. And so I do kind of appreciate it. I just hope they would take the extra step and explain how that affects the rest of the galaxy. And in general, I think this whole problem of introducing all these super duper unstoppable transporters is a big problem for Star Trek, because if everybody have that kind of technology, then that means no one really needs starships anymore. They can simply beam to other planets instantly. That's one of the problems with the transwarp transporter in the JJ movie, that it makes starships totally useless. If anyone can just beam to a different planet like in Stargate, and even without the limitation of appearing in another device, you can just appear anywhere you want on another planet in a different system instantly, then there is no use for starships anymore. So that will become a totally different kind of franchise if you introduce such technologies without getting rid of them in the end of the episode. And so once again, I guess it will never be mentioned again. So it showed up here, and yet everybody will forget about it later. Just like the magical device from the second episode, which could scan the room to know what happened previously. How come Picard didn't bring that device in this episode? I mean, he goes into Soji's room and tries to figure out what was going on there. So I was thinking, why didn't he bring that device from that woman? Why didn't he take those Romulans with him? Wouldn't they be really useful in his mission? So why did they stay behind exactly? It makes no sense. I was always assuming they will have some kind of subplot back on Earth. Maybe they will try to discover something about that Romulan Commodore or something like that. Maybe they will be the one to confront her. And yet they totally disappeared from the show. So what was the point to even establish those characters and then they disappear from the show? Why didn't they give him this device in which he could have scanned her room and see what she was doing previously? So it was totally something that was introduced for one scene and then disappeared. So I'm guessing all the other amazing technologies they will show, it always disappears later. So that's kind of stupid. So anyway, the Romulannisters finally discover where she came from, and so I'm guessing there will be some kind of attack on the android planet later. And maybe Hugh will somehow take over this cube. Maybe he will have a passionate speech to all the ex-Borg drones who will overthrow the Romulans, and then they will take the cube to help save the androids. I'm guessing there will be some kind of epic battle in the end of the show. Also, it was kind of stupid how Picard left Legolas on the cube. I mean, what was the point? He only has a sword, he has an army of Romulans running toward him, and we hear him in the end of the episode saying that they should surrender, but they kind of cut it off, and I wonder how exactly is he going to do anything against phasers. Like, every time this is brought up, they simply cut to somewhere else. They either beam him out, and in this case, they simply end the episode and we don't know what happened. I guess we'll wait and see next time, but it's kind of stupid how exactly is he useful against anyone with long-range weapons. I mean, the only times he's useful is when he catches people by surprise from the back and cuts off their heads. That's the only use he has in the show so far. And why didn't he simply go with Picard through that gateway? Finally, they go somewhere to some planet. Maybe that will be the planet on which Riker lives, I guess, because we did see that Riker is going to be in the next episode. So I'm guessing that's where Picard teleported to meet Riker for a cameo, even though it probably will be useless again, just another filler. But at least we have some kind of progress in the story, finally. And the episode did have some interesting moments, like those PTSD flashbacks, even though they were recycled footage from the previous movies, and so it felt a little bit lazy. But some parts of it was well done, and also the scenes on the cube, when they showed the size of the cube, and when they showed that the Borg drones were actually helping Picard, and he got scared. So some of those moments actually felt like in the spirit of Star Trek, like the Borg drones who he thought were attacking him turned out to be helping him. That was nice. Meeting Hugh was nice. So I think this episode was much better than the previous ones, and my ranking for it with my 5-light system, which is relative to the show itself, I think this episode has 3 lights out of 5. So that's my review. Let me know what you think and we can discuss it in the comment section below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.